What does it mean to call a covenant relationship everlasting? Welcome back to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we're continuing in our fourth lesson in our study of God's everlasting covenant, the promise. And at the heart of that covenant, frequently we hear the name Abraham always mentioned. And so this week with Professor Jody Washburn, we're going to focus on this Abrahamic covenant and really what we can learn about it. So Dr. Washburn, thank you again for joining us for Theology Sabbath School. And let's kind of jump right in. As I already mentioned, Abraham's name is always attached to the covenant, but we see other names attached to it throughout the Genesis account. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what we're to make of this Abrahamic covenant?
Yeah, sure. I think it's worthwhile as we start out, especially in a quarter when we're spending every week on one aspect or another of the covenant narrative, the thread that runs through the entire biblical text. It's worthwhile to think about that if we were to open up a study Bible and look at a tiny article on the covenant, we might be told, there's some elements of covenant in the creation story, and then there's the covenant with Noah, and the covenant with Abraham, and the covenant with David, and the covenant with Moses, the new covenant. We have these overarching headings, but it's never quite as clear-cut as we make it out to be in those tiny little articles or summaries. Even when we think of Abraham, there are different texts collected together here in Genesis that tell different aspects of this covenant. And we don't need to give an exhaustive account here, I don't think. But I think it's worthwhile to point out that in the narrative found in Genesis 12, we have what's called the call of Abraham. So Abraham is called to go where God will show him. And there's a line in that tiny little section. I mean, really, this is like verses 1 through 3 of Genesis chapter 12. And there's a line in there that it comes up over and over again in the biblical narrative. And it's part of this element of the line of Abraham, God promises, will be a blessing. It says, I will make your name great. I will make you into a great nation, backing up to the beginning of verse 2. And I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And that last little line that says, everyone is going to be blessed through this family line that's promised to Abraham, that line becomes a catchphrase that threads throughout the prophetic literature, particularly literature coming in after the exile when people were reimagining their identity as people of God. And then, of course, Carl, in the New Testament, this becomes key, especially in Acts, where now there's this vision of the gospel going to all peoples, not just this one family line. And so that's the emphasis there in that initial call story of Abraham. And then we often talk about the covenant with Abraham, but if we think about the text individually, in chapter 15 of Genesis, there's so much here, but I think the part that is worth noticing is that in this text, the relationship between God and Abraham is embodied. So there are kind of like what we would think of, you go to church, right, and you hold the bread and wine, or you experience something. Here, the relationship is shown experientially, and it's shown using like oaths in the biblical text, or even in the broader ancient world, were essentially conditional self-curses, where you act out and you say, okay, just like this little figurine is shattered, may I be shattered if I step out of the commitments of this relationship. And in this text in Genesis 15, you get this beautiful vision where you would expect Abraham to be compared to these cut pieces of animal, right? The animal is sacrificed and cut. But God is the one, right? The flame that's representing God goes between the animal pieces, embodying this covenant that the conditional self-curse God is taking on himself. Beautiful imagery of this relationship. And then lists, like I said, that you might see in a study Bible summary, they often talk about signs connected to the covenant and how the sign is different for each of these covenant stories in the biblical text. And it's in Genesis 17 that we come to the description of this relationship between God and Abraham that talks about the sign. And the sign of the covenant is circumcision. And many scholars point out that there seems to be a connection between the sign and what the essence of that covenant renewal is about. So at Sinai, for instance, their identity is no longer based on their production, right? So the sign is described as the Sabbath. They are still people, even if they're not working 24/7. And here, there's this promise of this line that would come out of Abraham and go through, right? And that God would bless all peoples of the earth through this line. And the sign is circumcision. So that's just a little overview of these different facets of this relationship between God and Abraham that are described in different texts, all collected in Genesis, right? And sometimes referred to very, like, as if it's one single thing, right? As the covenant with Abraham.
Yeah, with Abraham, it's over 25 years. And it is interesting. I mean, several things when you were speaking came to my mind, and that is you do see these signs attached. But to be honest with you, I'm far more comfortable with the sign of Noah, the rainbow, than I am with the cut pieces in chapter 15 of Genesis, or certainly the sign of circumcision in chapter 17. But through all of them, you get this thread, like you mentioned in chapter 12, that it's God is the one who's always the initiator. I mean, He's promised something for everyone, and so in that sense, even though this passage dates back 4,000 years to the time of Abraham, that you and I are included in that blessing to the entire earth. One of the things that always fascinates me in the Old Testament, and we see it connected with the story of Abraham and other places, is the importance of God's name, a name. I mean, names are important in the Old Testament, particularly in relationship to God, and His name sometimes is connected to these covenantal promises. Can you tell us a little bit about how names play into this theme of the covenant in the Old Testament?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think for one part of it is interesting just because we don't think of names in the same way. We pick a name based on we like the sound of it, or maybe like a favorite celebrity is named that, and so we want to be able to say that name when we call our kid. But there's a sense in which a person's whole legacy, identity, what makes them would be tied up in a name, and it's interesting. I'm kind of hedging here because I'm not sure how much to say about El Shaddai. But when God introduces Himself in chapter 17, He introduces Himself. The Lord appeared to Abraham, it says, and said, "I am El Shaddai." And El would have been the name for like any God, just the generic word for God that could refer to anything. And Shaddai is a dual form of a word that seems to have multiple meanings. So etymologically, it's connected to root words in cousin languages or in Hebrew that have multiple meanings. And I find this fascinating, and I don't know how much weight it has. Like, I would want to ask a rabbi or someone with a lot of Hebrew knowledge. But one of the meanings of the word shad in Hebrew is breast. So you have these connotations. And again, I don't want to say too much about how sure I am that these are the connotations, but there are all these connotations of El Shaddai meaning the almighty God, connected to the power that might be associated with a mountain range or those elements of nature that are just solid and provide for you, right? Provide security. And I love this idea that there's also the connotation of this providing that has more of a feminine, connotation. of nurture, of providing the basic needs of an infant. And all of that is wrapped up in this name. And I read this as intentional, right? That this is, I am El Shaddai. That all of those connotations can come together to say, like, who is this God who's coming to Abraham in chapter 17 and saying, here I am, right? I'm going to fulfill this promise to make you, your descendants, as numerous as the stars in the sky. And then, of course, the other name that's used for God in the stories with Abraham is Yod-He Vav-He, and that's the personal name of Judah's God, of ancient Israel. And even that one is fascinating. Like, if you want to think of a story that seems to have been told because it explained that name for God, it's the story of Moses at the burning bush, when Moses goes back and forth and says, well, what am I going to say? If they ask, who sent you? Well, what am I going to say? And initially it says, well, you will say, I am the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Go back to the patriarchs, to your foundations as a people group. And then Moses says, well, that's not enough, right? So then you get this explanation where you have a play on the word Yod-He Vav-He in Hebrew, and it's the imperfect, so ongoing, incomplete action sort of form of the word to be. So basically God says, I'm going to be who I am going to be. Like I am always, right? I am the essence of being, but I'm also God. So you can't nail me down. You'll always be discovering more about me, right? About who I am as your God. And so these elements, God coming as El Shaddai with these connotations of power and also of nurturing and providing the basic needs of an infant. And then this Yod-He Vav-He, right? I am who I will be. I will be who I will be. I am who I am. Faithfulness, the essence of being, all this is tied up. And I think that's an important part of this foundation narrative, right? Because Abraham is the father of the Jews. Abraham is like where the buck stops, right? The story goes back and starts with this figure who was called to go where I will show you, to step out into the unknown, knowing that, like Isaiah says in Isaiah 30, right? You will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. And Abraham is the paradigm of that kind of relationship. And so I think these names are important, the names of God. And it's not only with Abraham. There are other patriarchs too where God is referred to with very specific names. And I think there's always a tie-in with the narrative.
It's always just amazed me in the Old Testament how God reveals himself, as you pointed out, connected to his names. But what's ironic is when we go to Genesis chapter 18, it's God is the one who says Abraham is the person that he knows. So here we kind of shift from us learning about who God is by his name to God being the one who knows Abraham, and that Abraham is one who will command his descendants to follow in the path of God. I wonder if we could kind of switch in what you'd want to say about this picture of God as the one who knows.
Yeah, this is beautiful, and I think we don't often think about this text in Genesis 18 because it's a passage that makes us squirm. Frankly, it's a passage connected to these divine beings that visit Abraham, and there's this dialogue that goes back and forth. And I think we're not only uncomfortable with this passage because it's connected with the destruction of Sodom. I think we're uncomfortable with it for another reason too, and that is that a lot of us grew up with the, if it wasn't stated outright, it was at least implied that it was somehow disrespectful to have like a back and forth with God where you push, right? That the most reverent thing to do maybe is just to say, well, whatever is God's full and perfect will, and it's my job to accept. And there is a place for that, but this story pushes against that, and it shows this leading figure, Abraham, as being in this dialogue with God where Abraham says, but what about if there's this many righteous people, right? Then would you not destroy it? Well, what about if there's only this many? And Abraham keeps going back and forth, almost an early echo of what we see later with Moses, who intercedes on behalf of the people. What we see later in the book of Habakkuk, where the entire first 2 chapters are a dialogue where Habakkuk says something, then God is described as saying something back, like, oh yeah, I'm going to take care of that, here's how. And Habakkuk says, that is a terrible idea, don't do that. How could you think that's a good idea, right? And they go back and forth. And so this is not a lone case, but for some reason I think we're uncomfortable. So we don't often come to this text, probably for more than one reason. But there's this one part in it right at the beginning. So the narrative goes from this promise, this time next year, you and Sarah will have a child. And this is then, of course, the fulfillment of these promises from years prior. And then going into verse 17 of chapter 18, you have this question. It says, the Lord, and that's the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, name for God, the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? And then it goes on, Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him. And that's, in this translation I'm reading, that's the word know, yada. I know him. I have known him. So that he will command or direct or sharpen, like direct, like as in pushing your child to be as well equipped as possible. That's the connotation of this. He will direct his children and his household after him to keep, shamar, like to guard, to keep, to protect the way of the Lord. And then this next phrase to me is fascinating because this is a thread again that goes through the entire Hebrew Bible. The next phrase, he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised. And that phrase right there, this description, it's almost like God is talking to himself. He's like standing there and he's sort of in the foreground but sort of in the background, and he's saying to himself, well, I think I want to tell Abraham what's going on, and here's why. Because Abraham is a person who will pass down this legacy of relationship with me, right? And what that looks like is the way of the Lord, right, is doing tzedakah umishpat, righteousness and justice. And that word pair we are so familiar with from later in the Bible. Like if you want to think of a very well-known example, Amos 5:24, that says, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. This has been quoted by so many people. And that pairing of justice and righteousness happens over and over and over in the prophetic literature. And here, right at the beginning of the whole story of this people group, you have this word pair in this description that God has about who is Abraham. What does God know about Abraham, right? I know him, I have chosen him. And this is how God understands him, as the one who will embody and teach and create a legacy of justice and righteousness.
The idea of that word that God chose him or God knows him, to me is just an interesting connection, because when we talked a few weeks ago, we talked about the word keep or obey, meaning to hear. And so in this case, this idea of chosen and knowing, I wonder if we could expand on that just a little bit. Is the idea kind of like, if I'm thinking back to elementary school when people would choose people to be on their teams, etc. And that someone, their quality. So is that where the idea that like you choose someone because you know them, is that kind of the idea, the association between these two words?
I'm not sure. This word in Hebrew is so common. I mean, it's the same word used in the opening chapters of Genesis, like Adam knew his wife. So it has the connotation of intimate relationship. It has the connotation of just like knowing a fact. And it has such a broad usage that to figure out like what is the sort of, if you were to fill a page with bubbles, right? All the different connotations or ways this word could be used. It would be a variety. But I think that at least the NIV that is choosing to translate this as chosen, it does have that element, right? That I know that I want Abraham to be part of the story that is unfolding, right? This unfolding relationship I have with humanity. And in that sense, it does have some of those connotations of like, it's all about who you know.
And that's always the challenge, I know, and the beauty too of being able to look at the original language and kind of, because there's never a perfect, word for word equivalency that this word means that. It's always, like you said, like different connotations. And that's what makes the study of the Bible so rich. And we see that here in the story of Abraham. We see it with the names of God. So then I guess I wonder then to go back more to the end of what you were saying about, this dialogue God has with himself and the person Abraham is and why God has chosen him. It's interesting when we think about covenant because we talk about covenant blessings and covenant curses. And oftentimes there's this interplay of God's provision and the human aspect or responsibility. We might, I guess, perhaps our more maybe familiar description of that would be kind of faith versus works. What can we learn about that from Abraham, the man of faith?
That's a question I feel like we'll be answering our whole lives, thinking about this story. It always makes me chuckle to hear the certainty with which people talk about, faith and works. I mean, most of us have sort of what we consider our position on this, right? And we joke around like, do you prefer Paul or do you go with James? And this always makes me chuckle a little bit because, in the book of Hebrews, for instance, right? Abraham believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. Okay, that's a beautiful thing to say. But Abraham's life was in no sense linear. It wasn't like he went from being unrighteous to suddenly righteous and then it was all linear, going one direction or clear. He was human. He had no idea what was going on. He did the best he could in each situation, even though we can look back at parts of his story and think, oh, wow, that was really manipulative or really short-sighted or, And so I just find it, part of me chuckles and says it's maybe a grasping for safety that makes us want to be certain, like, okay, this part is faith and then this is the works. And if we have just the perfect balance, then we're good. Whereas I think any of us who have been in, let's just take long-term relationships as an analogy. The relationship changes and we can commit to someone even when we don't know a ton about them. So in a way we're learning about them, we're experimenting, like what goes well when we do things together, right? And what doesn't go so well, and then we adjust and we sort of intuitively know that in our human relationships. But I think sometimes we try to talk about our relationship with God as if we can figure out a static, ratio. If I do this many works and I have this much faith, then it's all going to work out. But if we learn anything from these stories, and I would say this doesn't just apply to Abraham, this would apply to all the iterations of the covenant and to the stories in between, is that this is a relational dynamic. It's always unfolding, always being reimagined. God initiates, then there's always this back and forth, and there's a level of experimentation on the human part, right? That we don't always know what to do, and we do the best we can, and then we try again a different way, and then we try to explain it to our kids a different way, and that unfolding. And so I don't know. I guess I'll probably be pondering this question my whole life. What can we learn from these covenant stories in the Hebrew Bible?
And that's the beauty of the story, because it gives us a chance to go back and read it again. And I know in my own personal faith journey, I've read these stories, hundreds of times, and there are things I see one time and then things I see later in life based on how my life experience has changed. So it is this growing relationship. And I guess maybe what I would say, and as I've tried to negotiate that balance between faith and works, I guess kind of the one anchor that I have is when I study Scripture, it seems to me that faith is always a response to God's initiative. So in that sense, and works kind of follows then from faith. So it's not so much that, I'm going to go out and I initiate, because God in all these contexts is the one who chose. Like he chose Abraham, he chose Noah. And I don't believe it's because that somehow they were more righteous than anyone else, but there was a willingness on their part to respond to God's call. And how we respond changes over our lifetime. When, as a kid, you get these kind of, very black and white perspectives on what it means to be a Christian. And then as you grow, that God can expand that. And that's probably one of the challenges, I think, for us in our Christian walk, is that we hear the childhood stories, and we think we've understood them, and we kind of want to keep them on that level, but then we get older and we mature and we grow, and if our faith and our understanding doesn't grow with us, then our experience will always be rooted in kind of the elementary aspect rather than growing and becoming, more meaningful and bigger and deeper for us. And that's where, for all of us, we're all on a journey, right? So being sensitive that others may not be where I am, and I think it's important for us in the Christian walk.
Yeah, and it really is. I think I just keep going back. My students help me with this. I always have at least one student in every general studies class that always points out, hey, it always comes back to relationship, always back to relationship. And I think, again, going back to the childhood, sense that I would be safe if I could figure out just the perfect ratio of works and faith. Like if we think back to a few weeks ago when we talked about covenant more generally, and Gregory Boyd's point, that sometimes we think of God as contractual, like as if we can manipulate him by doing certain things and then he'll have to do certain things back. But there's a sense in which if we trust someone, if we're in a mutually trusting relationship, like I think the covenant is painted as that's how this is supposed to unfold, right? That you do things not because you think it's gonna, I don't know, is that bad, right? Do I do the dishes because I want my partner to be approving of me and then do something back for me, right? Or do I do it because we have a vision together of a kind of relational space we want in our home, and we're both working toward that. We're wanting to offer our emotional attention, our love, our daily services as a contribution to that, right? And it's not, okay, how much am I putting in, how much am I getting out, and this constant transactional thing. And I think that's part of maturing, that we move away from a transactional way of thinking and we move toward a common goal, like this idea of God partnering with humans to create a heaven on earth, right? To create that justice and righteousness in whatever corner of the world we find ourselves in. So maybe you're making me think of Dave. Dave has a great way of talking about the idea of maturing. That the Hebrew Bible is calling us toward maturity, which probably is part of this move from transactional to partnership.
And maturity at first may sound like, oh, come on, that seems too simple. But isn't that our struggle? We often act in such immature ways. It becomes just kind of ingrained in us. But to be able to choose a higher path, and perhaps to go back to your analogy, sometimes we just do the dishes because we can't stand them because they're so dirty. We got to clean them up. So we just do them because we have to. We can't stand them. So
well, and I think that's the other part, is that we also have this like distorted idea that's over, what would you call it? We roll our eyes at young people who are too idealistic, and we think, oh, look, oh, how cute, they're so naive, they think they're going to be in love forever, and and that they're just going to be overflowing with this wanting to serve each other. And reality is, I mean, half the time we're keeping score at home, right? Well, I've done the dishes 5 times this week and you've only done it 4 times. No, I'm pretty sure I did it 6 times and you did it 5 times. Like, the reality is, even as our human relationships mature, it's not linear, right? There are moments when we act out of this gift that God gives us, this overflowing love. And there are moments that we just grit our teeth and do what has to be done. And I think in the biblical text, we're not told it has to be linear. Like, you don't move from always being transactional to always being, overflowing with trust and love and all of this just flowing naturally. That it's a much more maybe bumpy journey where you're experiencing bits of both. And maybe we could have a little bit less angst in our, Christian journeys if we could give ourselves space for that, right? Not only in our human-to-human relationships, but also in our relationship with God. That it's not going to be always one or the other. It's always there's a little bit of back and forth of a bit of this, right? A bit of I say this prayer, I do this act, right? Because I've committed to this lifelong partnership. And then another day, it might be flowing out. And it's okay. It's okay for all of that to be part of the journey.
And it's so simple and it's so true, and yet it's so hard, because I think that's what we've seen in societal studies with relationships. Often a marriage at about 5 to 7 years in, when things begin to change, they think there's something that's deficient in the relationship because it's not the same romantic new discovery that they first experienced. But actually there's a transition and an opportunity to become more mature and to experience love in a greater way. And then that's the beauty of when you make it through that transition, to look back and say, wow, I've learned so much, and I'm still learning myself, but I've learned so much about what it really means to love.
Yeah, and that I think, I know we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were thinking of the covenant overall, but just thinking about how Abraham's life, like you mentioned, these narratives that we have all bound together in this tiny section of one book of the Pentateuch, right, in Genesis, they happen over a span of years, even within his lifetime. And then you have that covenant relationship with Abraham as only one of many. So the covenant is all unfolding. It's always being reimagined at each turning point, at these various crisis points in the history of the people. And that's not a bad thing. Think about our relationship with our children or with childhood friends. We wouldn't assume, that we'll have the same relationship with a child when they're a tiny infant that we would when they're adults. We sort of are okay with these seasons and relationships being renegotiated at different points. Maybe we're not as good about thinking about that in terms of crisis. Often, for instance, marriages will fall apart after there's a tremendous loss and both people process it differently. So there are times when this is not as intuitive in our human-to-human relationships, but in the same way that we sort of do this, right? We renegotiate relationships at different turning point as the seasons of life change. I think we're seeing that in the biblical narrative. This relationship is unfolding, and there are different things emphasized at different points along the unfolding journey, because the needs are different.
And I think that's what makes the Abraham covenant such an important one, because it's not only the founder of Judaism, but there's so many stories where we really see this played out in a relationship that grows over time, and the change and the commitment in the life of Abraham. Our time is really just about up, but we could talk much longer. I think there's a lot of stuff we could say here, but I guess your closing thoughts, where should we take this? What can we learn from it? And kind of to summarize this in the 21st century, what's the take-home message that you felt that you find here in this week's lesson?
Boy, I think it's got to go in two from two of these verses. My takeaways stem from two of these verses. One, I am repeatedly struck as I go back and read and reread some stories in the Hebrew Bible, how much of the initiative is with God. You mentioned that earlier, and that's a thread that runs through so many different narratives. And the one text that the lesson pointed out, I think this might have even been the memory text for the week, and that is this idea that God establishes, right? I will establish my covenant. And so I think that's a takeaway for me. Sometimes I get frantic and I want to figure it all out, right? And lay it all out and do it all now. And so I find a certain amount of freedom in that idea that as we look at the Abraham narrative, and this will also be the case in many other iterations of the covenant, renegotiations, renewals of the covenant, is God is the one who establishes it. And there's a certain freedom in that. And then the other aspect is just this idea of partnering, where God is sort of on the sideline and he's talking about Abraham. He is the one who will teach his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord. And what does that look like? It looks like doing what is right and just, doing righteousness and justice. One rabbi that I was reading his take on this story earlier this week talked about those two words and how one has to do with retributive justice, like having a framework of society that allows for people to look out for their own interests but without harming other people, like a framework. And then the other has to do with distributive justice, the idea that blessings come, like the promise to Abraham, and then that our role as workers, as doers of righteousness and justice, is then to distribute that blessing. And I think it's just incredible that God chooses to involve humans in that work. We believe that's true today, and we read these stories. These characters were not translated, right? They're not heavenly beings that were somehow perfectly arrived in their likeness of God and then sort of transplanted here, but their feet are on the ground. And God comes, puts his feet on the ground next to these human beings and then invites them to partner with him in this work of righteousness and justice.
That's just so beautiful because it takes me back to that concept where God knows us, and even though he knows us, he's still chosen us. And what a blessing it is that he's the initiator who's called us unto himself. So Dr. Washburn, thank you again for your thoughts this afternoon, and for you, our viewers, for tuning in once again. I invite you to join us next week as we continue our theme of the covenant. Professor Brant Berglund will be our lead teacher, and we'll be talking about the children of the promise. So until then, take care, God bless, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.